Well, Alberta is definitely facing some fiscal challenges these days, some self-inflicted while others are outside the province's control. Proponents of separation argue that once Alberta unshackles itself from Canada, those challenges will vanish. One prominent Alberta economist has a large bucket of cold water to pour on those rosy assumptions. That's next on The Line, Alberta. Welcome, friends, to our very first episode of The Line, Alberta. My name is Rob Breakenridge, very much excited to be a part of this new endeavor and to be a part of The Line's expanding footprint. We'll bring you new episodes of this podcast each and every Wednesday as we delve into the important issues shaping the political and cultural discourse in Alberta and conversations with those with unique insights on all of it. Certainly one issue that's been dominating much of the conversation in Alberta in recent months has been the question of Alberta's place and future in Confederation. With a fourth straight Liberal victory in the recent federal election, not to mention the fourth straight election where Alberta voters opted for something different, there's been increased talk about Alberta separation. Now, with Alberta's Citizens Initiative legislation and the Premier's recent decision to lower the petition threshold, there's now a very real path that exists toward a referendum on Alberta separation. Now, for her part, the Premier says she's just trying to get a better deal for Alberta, and that can take the wind out of the separatist sails. For the committed separatists, though, it's too little too late. They say there's no deal that Mark Carney can offer that would be better than the riches that await a separate and sovereign Alberta. The Alberta Prosperity Project is the main group that's been pushing for a separation vote. They recently released a draft fiscal plan that projects tens of billions of dollars worth of surpluses once Alberta is no longer attached to Ottawa or Confederation. But is it really all that simple? Well, our next guest has done a deeper analysis of these claims and the realities that would confront a separate Alberta. He is, of course, also a close observer of the budgetary ups and downs of our current provincial government in Alberta. I had a chance to catch up with economist Trevor Tombe to talk about all of this. Here's that conversation. Well, joining us now for more on Alberta's fiscal challenges, the challenges we're facing in the here and now, and kind of the hypotheticals that have been thrown around with regard to the debate about Alberta's future in Canada. Very pleased to welcome to the program Trevor Tombe. He's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary and director of fiscal and economic policy at the School of Public Policy at the U of C. Trevor, great to have you with us here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Let's talk about the here and now. I mean, it's interesting. Alberta just concluded its fiscal year, running a surplus, interestingly enough. But there's some choppy waters ahead as we're looking at some deficits in the coming years, despite the fact that we're seeing near record levels of resource revenues. So what are some of the pressures we're dealing with right now?
Well, you're right to note that we have some pressures on the oil price front. We were counting last year on oil prices into the $70 per barrel, and this most recent budget that we got earlier in 2025 lowered that to 68. And with prices at about that level, they were indeed anticipating a pretty meaningful deficit in excess of $5 billion for the fiscal year. About 5.2 billion. Now, it is important to keep in mind that budget came out, think back to February of this year, a considerable uncertainty following dramatic changes in policy south of the border. And they had, as part of their budget, a pretty large contingency, about double what we usually see. So there is a lot of cushion already baked in. And if oil prices cooperate and economic disruptions are kind of minimal, certainly relative to what we expected, then we might, in fact, pull off a surplus this year.
Well, that's interesting. At the same time, too, as you say, with the price of oil that sagged a little bit, we're still anticipating roughly, I think, $17 billion in resource revenues. And some of those numbers we've seen in recent years, it's been as high as, I think, $22 billion in the previous year, as high as $25 billion. Those are the kind of levels we haven't really seen before in Alberta.
Yeah. Now, this is in part because of many major oil sands facilities transitioning to what's called the post-payout phase of our royalty system. So the past couple of years, we've actually seen a new normal on the fiscal side of things in the province, because once a facility pays off its past capital investments, then the amount of royalties that it pays per barrel effectively goes up by an order of magnitude. They're paying, depending on the price, between 25 to 40% of kind of net revenue that they earn from those barrels. And that's quite a bit. So it's really ratcheted up both the level of resource royalties in the province, but that comes with some trade-offs. It also means that royalties are a lot more volatile than they used to be. A $1 change is now, $1 per barrel change is now worth well over $700 million to the government, which is about triple what we used to see prior to COVID, for example.
That reliance that we've talked about for so long in Alberta, we're trying to get off of that reliance. And I know the Alberta government has talked about building up the Heritage Fund as maybe one way of, in the future, trying to reduce that reliance. But right now, I mean, those revenues that are coming in, it's almost all of it's going to government operations, it seems.
That's absolutely the case. And so what we've seen at the end of the last fiscal year, when we did bring in a larger surplus than anticipated, leaving the government with a considerable amount of cash that it can allocate to various things, it did deposit just the other day $2.8 billion additional dollars to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, bringing its total value, to about $30 billion. And that's quite a bit bigger than what it was valued at just a few years ago. So at the end of each fiscal year, when there's cash left over, the government can allocate some of it to debt, it can allocate some of it to saving in the Heritage Fund, or it can allocate some of it to one-time spending initiatives. And, we can only hope that in the future we do have surpluses available and the government sticks to its current approach of allocating some of that to the Heritage Fund. Because if that can be sustained over time, then that fund does grow and it generates returns. And those returns can, in principle, continue in perpetuity. And so what we need is a much, much larger savings fund in order to gradually ease reliance on royalty revenues.
There is the revenue side as well, beyond just resources. So the Alberta government did bring in a tax cut recently, something they had promised in the last election. So it's always been the balance in Alberta, I suppose, and having royalty revenues does make it a little easier to keep taxes low or keep spending high. But does this put additional pressure on the budget?
I wouldn't overstate how much additional pressure it creates. It certainly does. So it lowered income taxes and that lowered revenues by about $1.2 billion relative to what would have otherwise have been the case. And so in terms of the oil price per barrel that's needed to cover that, it's about $1.50 a barrel, give or take. And so effectively that income tax reduction ratchets up what the price we need in order to balance the provincial government budget by about that $1.50 per barrel level.
Right. Well, let's talk about this idea of what a sovereign or an independent Alberta would look like and how that would change the financial landscape for this province. You wrote about this at the hub.ca. And it's an interesting point you raised at the outset as why it's kind of the realm of economists here, because the idea of a nation or a country, that encompasses a lot of different things. But I guess in the context of Alberta, it's really come down to $2, hasn't it?
I think that's right. And so you see in other parts of the world, and Quebec obviously quite relevant here in Canada, where sovereignty is motivated typically by non-economic considerations. In Quebec's case, it's language and culture and deeper historical grievances that they have. It's really not about Quebec's economy being improved by separation. Often you'll have separatists there very explicitly recognizing the financial and economic costs of separation, but think it's a cost worth paying, right? And that's an interesting argument. But in Alberta, there's some survey evidence that I referenced from University of Alberta political scientist Jared Wesley and what's called the Viewpoint Alberta survey. And they find that among those who support Alberta separation, which is in recent years about 1/5 of the population, it's economic and tax-related reasons that are the primary motivator. And the number one motivator among 88% of those expressing support for independence is a desire to exit the equalization system. So the motivations for separation here, unlike Quebec, are very much anchored in dollars and cents in the economy, in finances. And the Alberta Prosperity Project, as the name implies, really leaning into this idea that prosperity would come from separating from the rest of Canada, released a report on what they think an independent Alberta government finances would look like upon separation. And it paints an incredibly rosy picture with surpluses of between 20 to as high as $45 billion and committing to eliminating personal and corporate income taxes and all sales taxes. And I took a look at kind of the numbers there, and they just don't add up. And the picture's not nearly as bright as the Prosperity Project promoting separation, I think, would like Albertans to believe.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I did want to touch on equalization because in a way, I think it kind of symbolizes inflows and outflows and what goes to Ottawa, what comes back. But as for equalization as a program itself, I guess it's worth, again, noting that it's not something separate. It's not something that Alberta pays into. And maybe there is some misunderstanding, I guess, about how it works. But just let's clarify that point first of all.
Sure. So equalization is a federal program, and it is funded from the same pool of dollars that pays for office supplies in federal agencies. It comes out of the same paperclip budget. It's just general revenue that's allocated to a federal program. We call it equalization, but no province is a part of it, and no province pays into it. And so separation itself doesn't have anything to do with equalization, but in fairness, Alberta residents and businesses do pay federal taxes, and those federal taxes fund programs like equalization. And there is a gap between the amount of revenues that the federal government raises from Alberta taxpayers compared to what the federal government spends back into the province on programs and transfers and so on. And that gap in the most recent years, about $14.5 billion. So in principle, if you had a separate Alberta, it could move into the fiscal space currently occupied by the federal government. And for some, that kind of gap between federal revenue and spending is part of the attraction of separation.
Right. And that often gets referred to as transfer payments, which is maybe what leads to confusion. But essentially, yes, it's about $14 billion, the difference between what Ottawa collects in federal taxes here and what comes back in terms of, I guess that includes everything, right? Direct transfers or other program spending.
Yeah. Exactly. So what Statistics Canada does every year is gather information on where federal revenues come from, all the different taxes and all the different sources of federal revenue, who's paying it, where are they located. So it breaks that down by province, and it also then looks on the transfer side of things. So federal old age security, for example, it knows where the recipient lives, or federal programs delivered in different parts of the country. It breaks that down by province as well. And there is this persistent gap between federal revenues and federal spending in Alberta, as there is in British Columbia and Ontario. Whereas in provinces with weaker economies, you tend to see the reverse, where federal spending is higher compared to revenues. And part of that shouldn't be too surprising. Most federal revenues come from income taxes and sales taxes. So provinces with stronger economies, higher average incomes, higher levels of consumption, kind of mechanically pay more in federal revenues.
Which I guess is also typical for wealthier areas. Even within Alberta, there are wealthy areas that pay more to the province than they get back, or wealthy neighborhoods like in Calgary that would pay more than they get back, right? It's a consequence in part of wealth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. And so if we had this data, Fort Mac would, top the list here of the amount of revenues raised by the provincial government. Calgary would punch above its weight as well. And then lower income parts of the province would see the reverse. And so we just don't collect data in that way, but we do at the province level. And that's why it usually gets a lot of attention, just because the data is really easy to look up and see. But yeah, it's kind of just a mechanical consequence of the underlying strength of economies. Now, I think it's a fair point to note that the federal government does generate more in revenue than is spent in the province. And that's what some point to as a reason why the federal policy scenes should maybe be a little more responsive to concerns raised, or adopt policies that don't adversely harm Alberta's economy, which is, I think, a legitimate set of conversations, but kind of separate from separation.
Right. Yeah. Policies come and go, governments come and go. That's not what you're addressing in your piece.
Exactly. And so I think reasonable people can disagree with a lot of federal policy. I mean, I certainly disagree with a lot of federal policy, but it was the piece that I put out in the Hub today looking at the fiscal and economic implications of separation was really more of a critique of that Alberta Prosperity Project numbers, pointing out that we would have 23.6 to 45.5 billion in surpluses just doesn't add up, especially when you're committing also to eliminating all income taxes and all sales taxes, which right there alone would eat up more than half of the revenue that the Prosperity Project assumes that a separate Alberta would have available to it. And then there's other things that are just kind of puzzling in terms of the financial analysis that they're putting forward. For example, they effectively eliminate all old age security and Canada child benefits. There's about $10 billion currently being received by Albertans now that just disappear from the Prosperity Project's fiscal plan. And then the military spending, only looking at between 3 to 5 billion in spending, even though if we were to be a separate country and a member of NATO, with a new 5% target, we'd have to spend $25 billion this year to meet that target, or spend 10 just to meet the 2% GDP target that they have. And then lastly, they look at the Alberta pension plan as something that would generate a good deal of investment returns, which is true. But then they use that investment returns in kind of the broader budget to kind of make the surplus larger. So it's like they're using the pension fund investment income in order to support the broader government operations. So there's just a lot of problems with the fiscal analysis that the Prosperity Project is putting out there. And this is the group that's kind of pushing for a referendum on separation. So I think it's important to take a good hard look at the numbers that they're putting in the window.
So that's the thing. You've got in Alberta right now a provincial government that does all the things that provincial governments are responsible for, but were Alberta to be its own country, now you're taking on those responsibilities like national defense, as you say, like things like old age security or border security. That's a long list. And those are a lot of additional costs that would have to be paid in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And the Prosperity Project is, upfront about that as a generic point, and they list 6 areas of federal government activity that then would need to be taken over by the province, such as national defense, Indigenous programming, international relations, employment insurance. But then they stop there, even though there's a lot of other things that the federal government does, not the least of which are old age security and the transfers to families with young kids through the child benefit that are just left off the table. And so there would be costs that the province would have to take on board that far exceed the costs that are put out there by the Prosperity Project.
You noted the point about the pension plan, and there's a debate. I mean, separate from the separation debate, whether Alberta should go its own way on a pension plan. I mean, Quebec does that already, of course, and there are pros and cons when it comes to that argument. But the idea, I guess, that a separate Alberta pension plan is somehow a revenue source for government, where does that come from?
Well, it could very well be if a government wanted to use the returns of the pension fund to fund government. That's not, in my view, a particularly prudent way to approach sustaining public pension plans, but a government could do it. And I do want to be clear that the Alberta pension plan as a policy idea is a completely legitimate area of conversation. As you say, there's pros and there's cons, and reasonable people will come down differently there. So I'm not critiquing that as a policy idea, but what they're counting on in the Prosperity Project financial analysis here is a little over $18 billion a year in investment income that would flow through to the government. Whereas right now, the Canada Pension Plan isn't incorporated into any government's books. It's not a part of the federal budget. It is not a part of any provincial government budget either. It's its own thing. It's like a separate entity that's kind of jointly run by the federal and provincial governments. But a separate Alberta pension plan, could be structured differently and would be subject to unilateral decisions of a future Alberta government, including a government that wanted to use the investment income for purposes other than sustaining the pension plan itself.
The whole issue of trade as well, and we've talked before about interprovincial trade and the cost of barriers. You talk in your piece about, even though the UK gained some autonomy, I guess, or independence when they left the EU, there were some trade consequences that flowed from that. So how do we need to look at that question? I mean, the cost of borders or the cost of additional barriers.
That's right. So this is where Alberta's economy could be affected by separation. You're right. Like we see in the United Kingdom, there'd be more autonomy. There'd be more ability to independently change rules and regulations and so on. But what that does is create what are called non-tariff barriers to trade, making it a little more costly for businesses to buy and sell across a border, just because the rules differ. And we have a lot of that already in Canada as well, interprovincially, and internal trade costs, and trying to mitigate them is a big focus that we've seen of many governments this year, including, to its credit, Alberta. But research looking at the United Kingdom has tried to measure how much these non-tariff barriers have increased. And it's increased, it's kind of a range, it's hard to be precise, by somewhere between 3 to 8%. So it's not an explicit tariff, but it's the regulatory frictions to trade that are equivalent to a tariff on the order of 3 to 8%. And what that does is ends up lowering productivity, because there are gains from trade. And so if you increase trade costs, and you're going to lose some of those gains. And again, estimates vary, but the UK economy is probably about 2 on the low end to maybe as much as 5% smaller than it would have otherwise have been were it not for the increase in these non-tariff barriers following Brexit. Now, fair enough if one looks at that and says it's a cost worth paying to achieve autonomy or non-economic objectives. That's fine. But in Alberta's case, we wouldn't want to neglect that cost. And my own estimates are that if you were to increase the cost of importing to or exporting from Alberta by about 5%, just to pick a number in the range there from the UK research, it would end up shrinking Alberta's economy by the equivalent of about 4%. Think about that as a productivity loss. And that'd be worth about $20 billion in foregone economic activity per year, or nearly $4,000 per person per year. So it would be a meaningful economic hit. Now, again, some might look at that and think that the increased autonomy that comes with that is worth it. But we shouldn't neglect the economic costs that would result. So it would weaken Alberta's economy because of those additional costs of trade.
Right. And that's even factoring in existing trade barriers. And I mean, hopefully we're on a path to reducing some of those. We've seen some progress, to be sure, but still Canada as an economic union, if we look at it that way, still has some value there.
Oh, absolutely. And I do hope that we see continued progress. We've seen lots of announcements from various governments. We'll see what the follow through is. But the challenge that Canada has is that, yeah, it's an economic union, but it's also a highly decentralized federation where rules and regulations in many important areas are determined at the province level. Yeah. And so when the rules are different from one place to another, that makes it hard for business to buy and sell or operate across those borders. And so what governments are announcing, led, I think, most recently by Ontario, but Alberta's also got itself agreements with different provincial governments, Nova Scotia, chief among them, where we're basically starting to mutually recognize each other's rules to say if a good is deemed safe for consumption and sale in one jurisdiction, it's automatically good to go in the other. And that's a really important step towards liberalizing internal trade in Canada. And what that would do is increase Canadian productivity and growth. But note that that's deepening the economic union, not Alberta withdrawing from it.
Yeah. I mean, you do note in your piece that Alberta leaving could certainly have consequences for the rest of the country, but it's also worth noting Alberta's, I guess, geography or the geographic reality where Alberta is landlocked. And one of the advantages of Canada when it works is that, you do have that coastal export access, but some of the challenges that might arise then from that reality.
Yeah, and this I'll note what Premier Smith here's mentioned quite frequently now in response to questions about separation, that her goal is to increase the amount of pipeline export capacity. And it's much easier to do those negotiations when you're at the same table as leaders from British Columbia or Saskatchewan or others across the country than if you were a separate independent country. And I think that's true and a good point. But now forget new pipelines. What would happen to the existing pipelines for Alberta if we were to separate? Most of our export capacity goes through British Columbia to the west or through Saskatchewan to the east on its way to the Midwest. And, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think about what a now separate Canada would do in terms of a fee or a toll levied on oil shipments through its territory. Right now, pipeline tolls are set in kind of a cost recovery fashion. But if we were to leave and Canada would have more flexibility on setting tolls on oil that's transiting through Canada from a separate Alberta, it could easily just charge much higher tolls to extract as much value as it could. And it ought to do that in terms of its own financial well-being. And so we would not only face greater challenges of building new pipeline infrastructure, but the existing pipelines would also be funneling a great deal of revenue to Canada if Alberta were to leave, because it would almost surely charge a lot more in terms of these transit taxes on those flows than it currently does.
Well, and I guess the importance, too, of laying all this out, I think, the parallel to the UK and what we saw in that Brexit debate was frustration with an actual status quo versus kind of a rosy hypothetical, what things could maybe possibly look like. And reality maybe didn't quite live up to that. So why is it important in Alberta's context to have as informed a debate and conversation around these issues as possible?
Well, any policy where the consequences are significant should have a great deal of hard-headed analysis so that we minimize the odds of a mistake, because this, as far as irreversible policies go, this would certainly be one of them. And we saw what happened in Brexit too, where remember that vote leave bus that was driving around, the pretty famous bus that plastered on the side was that they send 350 million pounds a week to the EU. And then the tagline was, let's fund our National Health Service instead. Yeah. That's a very similar flavor to what many in Alberta point to. The UK had a fiscal gap in terms of revenue versus spending with respect to the EU government, just as Alberta does with respect to Ottawa. But separating doesn't just give you that money back. It comes with all sorts of other consequences that you need to think about. Because what do we see in the UK now? Poll after poll is that a majority of residents there do kind of regret leaving the EU. And so that's unfortunate. And it's a mistake that we shouldn't so easily follow. So who knows where this goes? We're not even sure the referendum question will be put to Albertans. There is a threshold that they need. But if it is put to Albertans, then hopefully Albertans will reflect in a very serious and hard-headed way on that question and vote on the merits. And fair enough if someone supports it given the costs, but to take it seriously, to really evaluate the pros and cons, and not just treat it as a kind of vehicle to express frustration with federal policy. There's other ways to do that.
Absolutely. Well, your analysis, it's up at thehub.ca, much more as well, policyschool.ca. Professor Tombe, really appreciate the insight. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Once again, that is Trevor Tombe. He's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, also director of fiscal and economic policy at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Trevor is also a member, by the way, of the Premier's Alberta Next panel, which is hosting a series of town halls across the province, asking Albertans what sort of changes they'd like to see in terms of our relationship with Ottawa and ways that Alberta can assert more sovereignty. Again, this is something the Premier says can diffuse the separatist threat by giving Albertans a chance to voice their frustrations, to have an outlet for that, and to also find ways of strengthening our place within Confederation. Critics, though, say that this is all just giving legitimacy to the claims and grievances that separatists are advancing. We'll see where it all goes. It was interesting, by the way, to see some of the pushback from the separatist crowd to Professor Tombe's analysis. They're not happy about it, to say the least. They're also unhappy that Professor Tombe remains a member of the Alberta Next panel. It'd be a pretty flimsy basis to fire him, I think, and the separatists are free, I would imagine, to push back or to question Trevor's numbers. Now, I do want to let you know that we are going to hear from the separatist side of things. I think there's a lot of interest both within Alberta and across the country to better understand this movement, these frustrations, and where all of this is coming from. There's obviously a significant number of Albertans who feel this way. It is important, I believe, to better understand all of this. So that will be in our next episode. In the meantime, much more at our website, alberta.readtheline.ca. My name is Rob Breakenridge. Thanks for listening to The Line Alberta. We'll be back with a new episode next Wednesday. Take care.